So we covered the underrated stuff. Now we're going to go over the most overrated things in this game as it pertains to the build creation. Yeah, it's time to ruffle some feathers. I'm going to get some people upset. Going to talk shit about your favorite stuff. I don't really care. Now, as I mentioned in the underrated video, it's very hard to figure out whether things are underrated or overrated, and it kind of means things that are like underused or overused. So basically going to go based on that concept. And as always, it is just going to be for PvE. Now to start off with, into what I consider the most overrated crystal tier in the game, it is going to go to the OPALINE bubble tier. This crystal tier negates 99% of damage negation for the next hit, and that is basically it. Which at the point when you get it in the game, it's perfectly fine. But I don't know why a majority of people use it from start to finish, when the only thing it does is stop you from taking damage in one hit. Like that next hit could very well be off an attack that only does like 200 damage. But it could also be an attack that does like 2000 damage, and it could be very beneficial. But a crystal tier that's literally better at survivability would be the OPALINE hard tier. For 3 minutes, you get 15% damage negation, which that is obviously going to be so much more consistent, it's going to save you so much more health, and it's going to benefit you for a much longer period. Like the only benefit that the bubble tier actually does have is if you're doing a level 1 run, up until you get to the ritual shield talisman, which this talisman is literally better than the crystal tier. In most cases, sometimes in a level 1 run, the bubble tier might be a bit better. But when it comes to like regular builds, especially like later levels when you have lots of vigor, the OPALINE hard tier, even like the healing based crystal tiers, I'm just going to end up valuing these ones so much more. Now, the most overrated spell in the entire game, in my opinion, is going to go to Ancient Death Rancor. Which is, I can see the value in this spell and like a good stun locking tool for certain types of enemies, specifically just like the smaller ones. But it does so many things terribly that I can't justify it being anywhere close to the S tier like people imagine it to be. For starters, it actually is like a multi-projectile type of spell, therefore for like a big portion of the playthrough, it just does horrendous damage. It's just the way that like flat damage negation actually works in this game, that these types of spells just perform terribly up until you get to really late levels. Which to be fair, it actually is an intelligence and faith-based spell, and int faith builds are only really meant to be used at like really high levels once you've already hit the soft caps for intelligence or faith, or if you want to use weapons like the Sword of Knights in Flame or Alana's Twin Blades. So if this spell is only really good at later levels, there are other spells out there that also have an int faith based requirements that can just be better, namely the Rings of Spectral Light. This spell is just a much better version of Ancient Death Rancor. It's a much faster casting animation, much less FP cost, it goes incredibly far, you can fully charge it as well. It literally does more damage. It has like a little delayed effect, so it actually can be good at hitting these enemies like to input read just as well as Ancient Death Rancor can. Sometimes even better because Ancient Death Rancor tracking can be kind of shit at closer ranges. And Rings of Spectral Lights does frost buildup, and Ancient Death Rancor does not. Only thing that Ancient Death Rancor kind of has over it would be, as I mentioned, the stun lock potential and a bit more stance damage, but it's not even noticeable. And the thing is, there are lots of other spells in this game that also get really good stun lock potential, that it is going to output more DPS, but the ease of use is going to be there for Ancient Death Rancor, because it is going to be more of like a range-based tracking projectile. So for some enemies like Millennia, it can be a bit okay, probably more so for the first phase, because for the second phase, he's very aggressive. So if the only use for this spell is for a high-level intelligence faith-based build that's good at stun locking smaller enemies at a further distance, like that's like the most B-tier sounding spell of all time. Now when it comes to the most overrated weapon in the game, it's kind of hard to pick from because I don't really know too many people's like ranking lists that a lot of people might end up agreeing with, that I end up disagreeing with, and it always just ends up resulting into like which weapons tend to just be the most overused. And because people end up finding success with that weapon, they'll like end up swearing by it being like a top 10 weapon option. Which if that's the case, it has to go to a katana, which is like by far the most popular weapon category in the game. And half the non-infusible katanas, in my opinion, are just completely overrated by a whole bunch of people. And as much as I do want to talk about the meteoric ore blade being completely mid and trash, somehow, some way, I'm still going to have to talk about the Rivers of Blood. In 2025, I'm still seeing videos where the Rivers of Blood is listed as a top 10 weapon, and I don't really understand why. Like, it is a really good weapon, and I think most of the reason why I do consider it to be overrated is based on how far into the playthrough you get the Rivers of Blood. Because if you could get it a lot earlier, I'd find a lot more value in this thing. Because Somber based weapons are always going to be easier to upgrade, and having like more early game arcane options is never going to be a bad thing. But as it stands right now, this weapon is pretty much just outclassed by like a Nagakiba double slash type of build. And by the time that you get the Rivers of Blood, you're more likely than not going to have like a close to max leveled smithing based weapon. And double slash Nagakiba or Uchigatana will just outbeat it. Whether it be with like a dexterity blood flame blade build or an occult arcane build, it's just going to do more damage, it'll do more blood loss build up. And be that most of the damage of the Rivers of Blood weapon skill does actually come from the weapon hitbox, because like the projectile portion doesn't do anywhere near as much damage as it used to do. It's just not going to be as good, especially compared to the Nagakiba, which gets much more range. And the funny thing is, double slash literally consumes 3 times less the FP as Corpse Piler does. And that's not also to mention that the infusible katanas are going to have more versatility to be infused with other different types of skills. Sometimes you don't want to have like the high DPS skill that double slash does, and sometimes you want like a more stance breaking option, which Rivers of Blood doesn't really get that. But with the infusible katanas, you can use things like Unsheath and actually gain that, while actually having better synergy with things like the Dragon Communion Seal and getting better spell-based damage too. But I still don't think the Rivers of Blood is a bad weapon by any means. It's easy to upgrade, it's still a katana, and it does get like an extended part to the double slash based skill. So it can be good at like doing some chip damage at a further distance and some like chip bleed buildup. And yes, against Millennia, which is arguably still like the hardest boss in the entire game, this thing can make very quick work of her, because she is weaker to fire damage, and using skills that do hit at these further distances can just cheese her completely. So it might be a top 10 up specifically against Millennia, but for the rest of the game, it's not even close to the S tier. Now, the second most overrated thing that I want to talk about is the frost resetting builds. I do not know why, who, or when these things became a thing, and why they're still even a thing that people talk about. But the action of going out of your way to reset frost just so you can proc it again is a terrible build concept. It might work specifically good against like one boss out there, maybe like at higher New Game Plus, but the whole build concept is like 10 times worse than your average bleed build, because the whole idea is to constantly keep proccing that frost, because frost does do a 10% flat damage, but the thing is it actually debuffs enemies for the next 30 seconds. So you have to wait out that 30 seconds just to be able to proc that frost again to get that 10% more damage. But you actually can use some fire damaging sources to remove the frost, and that way you actually can proc it again. But the thing is, why would you want to do that? The best part of the frost status effect is the debuff itself. Enemies take 20% more damage for those 30 seconds. Why would you want to remove that? In that time, you could just use like your other damaging based stuff to get a bunch more damage off, and when it wears off, you can just proc the frost again. Because in this game, the more that you proc a status effect, the harder it is the second, third, and fourth time. So if you are fighting a boss and you go to try and proc frost on an enemy like the third or fourth time, it's going to take like a whole ass minute to try and do it. I was using certain types of things like Zamor Ice Storm or the Death Poker, because these types of skills can do it really fast, but I still wouldn't really care to use it because I'd rather just continuously spam the skill to benefit off that boosted damage that the enemies are taking. And also another thing is that you have to go out of your way to actually use fire damage. You have to implement a fire damage source a part of your build. It means that you're hurting your total DPS just to be able to proc the frost again, which is a silly concept. Like if you wanted to build like that, just use bleed, because every single time you proc bleed, it's 15% damage. You don't have to do something else to reset it to actually proc it again. For most bleed builds, you can actually proc it way faster than you actually can proc frost. And there are other buffs out there like the Wipe Mask, Lord of Blood Exaltation, Sacred Bloody Flesh. All these buffs can actually help boost your damage when you do proc bleed, that this whole playstyle is just made so much better. Like it is still viable, and if you like it aesthetically speaking, sure, but stop trying to convince people that frost resetting builds are actually good. Like any single time that a fire-based source can actually reset frost, that's actually a bad thing. You actually want to have the fire damaging source not be able to reset the frost. Now, the number one most overrated item in the entirety of Elden Ring is going to go to the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman, and it's not even close. If you don't know, I made a video like a few months ago ranking every single talisman in the game, and I did put the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman in the C tier where it belongs, and I had so many commenters trying to convince me that this thing was actually like an S tier option and like one of the best talismans in the entire game, which is like one of the most untrue statements I've ever heard in my entire life, and I can break it down as to how mediocre this talisman actually is. Now, my original sentiment about the talisman is that it's only really useful if you're AFK in a dungeon. Sometimes it might be pretty cool if you're doing like some spell or skill only runs, and if you've got to like re-allot your flasks. But outside of those things, there is practically no reason to use it, hence it being in the C tier, because the talisman itself gives 1 FP for every 2 seconds, meaning that it takes 22 seconds just to get 1 Catch Flame. It takes 40 something seconds just to get 1 Knight's Comet, which that is like the worst cooldown for like these really quick spamming types of spells. And the thing that makes it especially mediocre is when you actually get it in the game. It's all the way in the DLC. If this thing was like early game, like the Blessed Dew Talisman, it would actually be useful because it wouldn't be directly outclassed by other talismans. Now you might be thinking, what other talismans directly outclass the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman? Practically most of the damage boosting talismans are just going to end up outclassing it, because one of the best ways to save FP is by getting more damage. Like the more damage you have out of your spells or your skills, the more FP that you're saving. And you can save it at a much faster rate depending on the skill or the spell than you ever would with the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman. Also, talismans like the Carrion Filigree Crest, the Assassin Cerulean Dagger, the Old Lord's Talisman, I just value these ones more when it comes to saving FP, even though I don't really care for them that much. For the Carrion Filigree Crest, if you're using a skill that consumes like 25 to 30 FP, you're saving roughly 8 FP every single cast. Use it a couple of times, that's about 16 FP, which is like over 30 seconds worth of waiting with the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman, which that's mainly used for a boss fight fight, throughout legacy dungeons or dungeons, using the Assassin's Cerulean Dagger is literally 15% of your FP bar back in just one critical attack. You can like backstab the same enemy 3 times in a row and get minutes worth of the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman FP in basically just a few seconds. But what is the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman actually saving? FP, and potentially your FP flasks. Because otherwise you just stack up on a bunch of FP flasks, right? You get so many flasks in this game. Why not just go with a bunch of FP flasks? And that's because your FP flasks also determine how many healing flasks you have. So inherently, if you're saving on healing flasks, you're saving on blue flasks. Therefore, using things like damage negation talismans, the Crimson Seed talisman, they're going to be so much better for you when it comes to saving flasks than the Blessed Blue Dew talisman ever would. For instance, if you just heal 3 times with the Crimson Seed talisman, you've saved yourself 1 flask. If you get hit like 4 or 5 times while having like a damage negation talisman, you've pretty much saved 1 flask. Now, to save 1 flask with a Blessed Blue Dew talisman, do you know how long it takes? But if you had 15 mind, it's going to take over 3 minutes to save 1 flask. 3 minutes. And the thing is, this is actually assuming that you're not always going to be at max FP, which I might as well now just talk about mind, because most people end up justifying the fact that if you just have low amounts of mind, it's going to be pretty decent. But the thing is, if you plan to use FP, there's no reason to have low amounts of mind, especially by the time that you do get to the DLC. Because a lot of the stats in these games, you benefit like very little by actually speccing into them, but mind is actually one of the few stats that gives you a pretty decent return. Like so many people would rather just have like 80 dexterity or 80 strength and just have like 15 mind for some reason, and actually still plan to use things like skills and spells. And I don't understand that. Because look at this weapon right here, the Urumi. This thing gets an S scaling and dexterity with a keen infusion, and you're not going to get better than an S scaling, right? Now the difference between 40 and 60 dexterity is only a 15% damage increase. Only 15% between 40 and 60 dexterity with an S scaling. So it's only going to be like an 8% damage increase for 10 whole levels. And as for an S scaling, for most builds, it's only going to be like a B or an A scaling, and it's going to be even less than that. Maybe like a 5 or 6% damage increase for 10 whole levels. Between 15 and 25 mind, it is a 50% FP increase. So instead of having 15 mind, if you spec into 25 mind instead, you're giving yourself an extra 50 FP, which is 100 seconds worth of FP when it comes to the talisman. And the thing is, that just increases the bar. The more FP flasks that you have, the more returns that you get. With like 3 or 4 FP flasks, you're actually saving 200 to 300 FP. So this whole sentiment with the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman is really good for like lower FP types of builds. It doesn't really make much sense. Now, when it does come to the comments that I actually did receive when it came to the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman, one was the whole like Bestial Vitality thing being infinitely used, and the other one was its pairing alongside cheaper types of spells and skills like Discus Hurl or Discus of Lights, because those things only consume 3 FP. So with the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman, it's like you had infinite amount of FP. Now, I might address that one first, because the thing is, yeah, you can have infinite amounts of FP, but as I just mentioned, if you have around about 20 to 25 mind, you're going to be able to cast Discus Hurl or Discus of Light over 30 to 40 times. So it's just a completely wasted talisman slot because you already have way more than enough casts. Using things like the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman on top of these things is just useless, because those things are already FP efficient. You're better off using things like damage boosting stuff to kill enemies faster. And once again, the damage negation things, they're going to save your flasks. Now, when it comes to the whole Bestial Vitality thing, the whole like talk about that was by the time that the Bestial Vitality wears off, with the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman, you have all that FP back and you can use it again. So you basically have a perpetual 4 HP per second, which 4 HP per second towards the later half of the game is practically useless. But even if it was to be useful, how many times are you going to be using Bestial Vitality in a boss fight or between graces? There's no way that you're actually using it any more than like 3 or 4 times. And Bestial Vitality only consumes 18 FP. It only consumes 18 FP. If you only have 10 mind, you can use Bestial Vitality 4 times. When do you need to use Bestial Vitality more than 4 times? Assuming that you just have no FP flasks, no minds, and you don't care about that stuff at all, but you might as well just use a spell because why not? You can very well use Bestial Vitality, but you already have at least 4 casts. And the thing is, if you're going to be using buffs like Bestial Vitality, you're probably using other buffs out there. You might be using things like Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength. Maybe you want to use things like Chilling Mist, Assassin's Gambit. There's all these like other really good like secondary based buffs out there. And if you're just using more than one type of spell, then the whole like infinite Bestial Vitality thing is just made this useless, because you're going to end up having to use an FP flask when you eventually end up running out of FP with all the buffs that you've been using. So like none of it makes sense. If you're just using Bestial Vitality by itself, there's no need for it. And if you're using other types of spells, then there's also no need for it. Like, the only real good justification that I actually did see for the Blessed Blue Dew talisman was if you did like run out of FP, you actually can use Ashes of War while not having to wait as long. Because if you don't know, you only need to beat like 50% of the FP cost requirements to use a weapon skill. So instead of having to wait 18 seconds to use Impaling Thrust, you only have to wait 9, which having a build that centers around not having any FP is just very niche, because that means you can't really use it on demand. And as I've been mentioning, the same thing still applies. If you wanted to save on FP, there are other things out there that are just better. So this talisman, from a theoretical and practical standpoint, is unequivocally and completely outclassed by so many other talismans, and there's no way or no good justification for this thing to be anywhere close to the S tier. Okay, that is that. We are now done. The next video will probably end up being something Soulsborne related. I am in the middle of doing a straight sword marathon where I beat all the Souls games with a straight sword. So you can follow me on Twitch there or subscribe for that video, because I'll be out within the next few days. And you catch you guys around. Bye.